Well, welcome to the Campfire. Good to see you. And by golly, we're going to have some fun tonight. It's always fun to hear good campfire stories. And this story was sent in by Amber Ingram. She's up in Anchorage, Alaska. She called this the night of the Sasquatch. You know, and this is going to be a fun story. Somebody told them something and they're sending it to us. And you can do the same thing. You can send us a story. If you've got one you want to hear read on this here channel, send it to thehiddencorners.story@gmail.com. That's one word, thehiddencorners.story@gmail.com. And we'll give it a shot. So, the night of the Sasquatch. The fire crackled and danced in the center of the circle, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The night was clear and crisp, with the Alaskan wilderness stretching out in every direction, a vast expanse of darkness and mystery. Now 5 friends and I sat around the campfire, our faces illuminated by the orange glow of the flickering flames. We had come to this remote part of the state for a weekend of camping and fishing and storytelling. The 6 of us had been best friends since high school when we discovered we all shared a mutual sense of adventure, enjoyed being out in the wilderness camping, hiking, fishing, and exploring. Every year since we graduated, though we live in separate towns and even states now, we've gathered back together to spend a week-long camping trip. As the fires jumped up into the sky and we were all getting settled and it was cooling off a bit, my boyfriend Jason leaned forward, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Who's up for a good old-fashioned campfire story?" he asked with just a hint of challenge. "I've got one," I said, my voice low and matching his mischievousness, "but it's not for the faint of heart." Now everyone leaned in, their curiosity piqued. "Well, we've all heard of the Alaskan Sasquatch," I began. I know some of you call it Bigfoot, but up here in Alaska, it's known as the Bushman. There's an old legend that says this creature roams the forest, rarely seen but always watching. The wind rustled through the trees as if in response to my words. Now, a few years back, an old trapper named Hank lived in these here woods, I continued. He was a tough old guy. He spent his whole life out here. I met him one night in a bar in Juneau, and he told me this here story. One winter, he started finding his trap sprung, but empty, as if something was just toying with him. So he set up camp one night, determined to catch whatever was messing with his livelihood. Jason smirked. "Let me guess, it was the Sasquatch?" I shrugged his shoulder, but my expression remained serious. Hank thought it might be one of his neighbors, a guy who didn't like the idea of him trapping live animals. Now, he decided to stay awake and keep watch. And around midnight he heard something, heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. Far too heavy for any man he knew. So he grabbed his rifle and he peered off into the darkness, but he saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the forest was silent. Well, the friends all exchanged uneasy glances. The fire now feeling like their only protection against the encroaching night, everyone started listening more intently. Now, this went on for weeks, and old Hank was getting angrier than ever. He decided to confront his neighbor, who lived a good walking distance from Hank's cabin. Well, when he got there, he found the man dead, lying on his front porch in a pool of blood. His body was just ripped apart. Then, just as Hank turned his head to throw up, he saw it. A massive figure standing just in the clearing to the cabin. It was covered in thick, matted fur, its eyes glowing red like fire. His mouth and hands were covered in blood. Hank froze, too terrified to move. The creature stared at him for what felt like hours, then turned and disappeared into the forest. "Well, what happened to Hank?" my friend Sarah asked. Her voice was trembling. "He ran all the way back to his cabin, determined to put as much distance between himself and the dead neighbor as he could. But the next morning, he found tracks all around his cabin. Big, huge footprints, unlike anything he'd ever seen. So he packed up and he left the next day. He swore the Sasquatch was real and it was watching him. He told authorities about his neighbor, but when they went back to investigate, there wasn't nothing left of the man, just some dried blood on the porch. Of course, no one believed him when he said it was a Sasquatch, but they couldn't prove it was Hank either. My friends all sat in silence, the crackling fire the only sound. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but just then, a sudden, loud snap of a branch echoed through the woods. Everyone jumped. Hearts were beating fast. It's probably just a deer, Jason said, though his voice trembled just a bit. My friend Amy laughed nervously, but the tension remained. And one by one, eventually everyone retreated to their tents, the story lingering in their minds. As the fire died down, the forest grew darker and more silent. Jason and I sat alone, watching the dying embers. I looked up, and just beyond the edge of the campfire light, I saw a pair of red eyes watching us from the shadows. I grabbed Jason's arm and pointed with my eyes towards the sight, but the glowing red eyes quickly vanished into the darkness of the night. I let out a gasp, but Jason put his arm around me and assured me that it was just my imagination after telling everyone the scary campfire story. I decided he must be right, and we both went to our tent, but neither one of us could sleep. We both just lay there, practically all night long, listening for footsteps, crackling twigs, or anything else that might alert us to the presence in the woods. Now, the next morning, everyone woke up to find our campsite just undisturbed, though a sense of unease lingered from the night before. We decided to explore a nearby stream, loaded up our fishing gear, secured our campsite from any intruders, such as a bear or a deer. And as we trekked through the dense forest, Jason suddenly halted, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Guys, I think I see something. Over there through the trees," he called out. Well, we all gathered around him and saw what had caught his attention. It looked like an old, weathered cabin. My friends all looked at me with wonderment. "You were telling the truth last night? We thought you'd made that story up." "Well, I did actually meet an old man named Hank at the bar in Juneau, just like I said. And he told me he used to live out this direction. But I didn't actually know we were that close to where he lived. I can't believe we found his cabin," I said. "Well, it might not be Hank's," Jason replied. It could be anyone's old abandoned cabin. Let's just go take a look." The trees and the bushes were thick all around the cabin, but we made our way through the thick underbrush until we were standing in a clearing. If you could call it that, it was obvious that no one had been here in a very long time. The door was halfway hanging on its hinges, as if it had been forced open and brush had grown up through the floorboards of the porch. Everywhere, vines and grasses and small saplings threatened to take over that small wooden structure. We weren't sure if it was safe to walk across the floorboards to the front door. They looked as if they no longer support the weight of a human. The cabin was small, at the most only 2 rooms, with an outhouse in the back that was pretty lean and awkwardly, half buried in a sunken hole it used to sit on top of. But there was still glass in the windows that remained unbroken, due to the many boards that had been nailed across them. Jason got up the courage to try the floorboards on the wide porch, and though they creaked and moaned as he gingerly stepped across them, he made it to the entrance of the cabin and managed to get the door totally unstuck. We each took turns following him inside. It was obvious the inside of the cabin had not seen a human in many years by the look of the dust that covered the floor and every other surface of the interior. There was a small table and a chair and a cot for sleeping on. A small kitchen stove was off to one side, and a very small wood stove occupied the space of another corner. I ran my finger along the thick dust on the table and was commenting on how dirty everything was when my finger ran across what appeared to be a notebook. It had been so covered with dust it was impossible to see it until my finger had run across it. Now everyone gathered around, looking over my shoulder as I opened the notebook. The pages were old and dirty, but still legible. Someone had written on the pages with a black pen with pretty shaky handwriting. Now, we all just assumed the notebook was Hank's, with all the detailed accounts of what he experienced with his traps and his suspicions. We found pages upon pages filled with detailed accounts of his many encounters with what he at first believed to be his neighbor, each one more terrifying than the last. The final entry was dated just days before he left this area for good. And why he left his notebook behind, we would never know. He told of suspecting that someone was spying on him, a feeling of constantly being watched. He explained how he started noticing his traps were being sprung and his game was being stolen. He saw footprints that were much too large to be human and thought his neighbor was trying to put one over on him. And then, as we read his last entry out loud, it sent chills down our spine. The Bushman is more than just a legend. It's watching me, always watching me. I fear it will not let me leave these woods alive. I hear him clawing at my cabin door at night, which I have boarded up. All the windows are boarded up as well. If I make it through this night, I'm leaving here tomorrow. The group all exchanged nervous glances. Boy, we need to get out of here, I said, my voice shaking. As we turned to head back to our camp, we heard a distant, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything any of us had ever heard. What was that? My friend Sarah whispered, her eyes just wide with fear. Jason turned around, his face pale. I think Hank's warnings were real. We need to leave, and now. The growls were getting louder, and we could now hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching us through the forest. We ran back to our campsite just as fast as our legs could carry us, packing everything up as quickly as we could, our fear mounting with each passing second. And as we drove away, the forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening with everything looking menacing. I had brought the notebook with me from my cabin, and it was lying in the seat between Jason and me. I looked down and noticed a small folded piece of paper that had fallen out of the notebook and had fluttered to the floorboard near my foot. On it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Find the cave. It holds the answers, but beware the Bushman." In the weeks that followed, our experience in those woods haunted us, but the fear we felt at the time seemed to diminish. We all became intrigued by the note I had found, and so we decided, with a little bravery, to return the following year to search for the cave. Little did we know, our adventure had only just begun. A year had passed, and once again it was time for the 6 of us to gather for our annual camping excursion. Now, for Jason and I, the drive back to the previous year's camping site was filled with tense silence. Both of us lost in our thoughts about the notebook, terrifying growl we'd heard the previous time. When we reached a small town at the edge of the wilderness, we headed straight for the local diner, where we were scheduled to meet the others. Now, inside the diner, our friends already occupied a booth in the corner. I brought the notebook out of my bag and I proceeded to open it to a rough, hand-drawn map that Hank, or whoever the former owner was, had left us. The map was not real detailed, but it showed a general area surrounding the cabin. Now, we all agreed to rest for the night and head out at first light, determined to uncover this mysterious cave. I have to admit, I had second thoughts now that we were back in the vicinity of the cabin. I clearly remembered the glowing red eyes and the terrifying growling we had heard the last time we were here. But Jason seemed excited, so I tried not to show my apprehension. The next morning, we set out with renewed determination. Armed with the notebook, some basic camping gear, and a topographic map we'd purchased, we retraced our steps to the stream and followed it to the cabin. And then from there, we followed the roughly drawn map, intent on finding this here cave. The journey, it was difficult. The forest was thick, pretty unyielding. Hours passed as we navigated through dense underbrush and over rocks, and just as doubt began to creep in, we stumbled upon a rocky outcrop that matched the notebook's description. "There," Jason said, pointing to a dark opening in the rocks. "That must be the cave." The cave's entrance was narrow and overgrown with moss, but it widened as we ventured deeper in. The air inside was cool and damp, and our footsteps echoed loudly on the stone floor. Using our flashlights, we carefully made our way inside, our breath visible in the cold air. Further in, we found remnants of a camp, an old rusted lantern, empty cans, and a tattered blanket. And as we explored deeper, we found strange markings on the walls, symbols and crude drawings that seemed to tell a story. One depiction showed a massive figure, unmistakably the Bushman, surrounded by smaller human figures. Another showed what looked like a ritual or an offering. "God, this is creepy," I said, shivering. At the back of the cave, we found a small alcove with a wooden chest. Excitedly, Jason opened it. Inside were more notebooks, older and more fragile than the one that we had. There were also old photographs, yellow with age, showing blurry images of a large, shadowy figure in the forest. It seemed the photographer never got close enough to get a good close-up of it. As we were examining the contents of the chest, we heard a low growl echo through the cave. We all froze, our hearts pounding. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, steadily approaching us. "We need to leave now," Jason whispered urgently. We grabbed what we could of the notebooks and the photographs and ran as fast as we could out of that cave, the growls getting louder and more menacing by the second. As we emerged into the daylight, we saw movement in the shadows. Not just one, but several large hulking shapes that seemed to melt into the forest. We all ran, not stopping until we reached our cars. Once we were back in town, we gathered at the same diner that we had been at earlier. When we were all there, we spread the notebooks and the photographs on the table. "We need to tell someone about this," Jason said. His voice sounded real shaky. "But who would believe us?" I countered. We barely believe it ourselves." Jason held up a photograph, his eyes scanning the image. "We don't need them to believe us. We just need them to listen. And I think I know one person who might." On the back of the photograph was a name and an address. The photograph was from the 1960s, belonging to a renowned cryptozoologist who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. "Now, this guy was searching for the Bushman decades ago," Jason said. "I can't believe the coincidence, but I just watched a documentary the other night on cryptids and this guy's name was mentioned. This professor talked about how he had disappeared decades ago in the wilds of Alaska while searching for the Bigfoot. They could never find his body." "Well, how's that going to help us?" I asked. "Well, the person who was telling his story was a retired professor named Dr. Brooks. I remember it because she lives in Anchorage, and I had a teacher once by that name. I don't know if it's the same professor or not, but anyway, that's how I remembered her name. And if we look her up, she will definitely listen to our story, especially since we've got notebooks and photographs to prove it." We all exchanged glances. We knew we had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but what we didn't know was that our journey was far from over. The hunt for the truth about the Bushman was just beginning, and we were about to delve even deeper into the mystery. We spent the next few days researching the cryptozoologist Dr. Robert Thorne, who had vanished in the 1960s, while investigating reports of the Bushman in Alaska. We discovered that Dr. Thorne was a respected scientist who had dedicated his life to studying legendary creatures, also known as cryptids, all around the world. His disappearance had been a mystery, with many speculating that he had either succumbed to the harsh wilderness or fallen victim to one of the very creatures that he sought. Jason managed to track down the old colleague of Dr. Thorne's, the retired professor named Dr. Eleanor Brooks. She lived in Anchorage. When Jason explained why he was contacting her, she seemed very anxious to meet with all of us, and she wanted to see the notebooks and the photographs for herself. Well, Dr. Brooks welcomed us into her cozy home. Her walls were lined with books and artifacts from various expeditions. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes that still sparkled with curiosity. She seemed pretty spunky and spry for her age. Dr. Thorne was a brilliant man, she said, sipping her cup of coffee. He was convinced that the Bushman was real and spent years collecting evidence. His last letters to me mentioned that he had found something significant, but then he disappeared. We shared what we had found, and she examined it with great interest. "This is remarkable," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "These drawings and notebooks align with Thorne's theories. He believed that the Bushman was not just an elusive creature, but a guardian of the forest, protecting it from human intrusion." "Did he ever mention a cave?" Jason asked. Dr. Brooks nodded. "Yes. He wrote about an old cave he was exploring. He believed it to be sacred to the local Native American tribe. He said the local tribes that inhabited the region had many encounters with the Bushmen." Dr. Brooks pulled out an old map from our archives, marked with several locations where Dr. Thorne had conducted his research. One spot, deep in the wilderness, was circled and annotated with notes about unusual sightings and strange occurrences. "Now this is where he was last seen," she said. "If you can find it, you might find more clues about what has happened to him." I studied the map closely. It didn't appear to be the same cave we had found, but instead another larger and a deeper cave. We were scared, but the quest had now taken a hold of us, and none of us wanted to back out. And Dr. Brooks asked if she could accompany us. Though she was elderly, she appeared to be physically fit enough to handle the trek, so we all agreed to take her with us. This time, our journey took us further into the Alaskan wilderness than any of us had ever been before. The terrain was rugged. Dr. Brooks's age and physical capabilities slowed us down a bit. After a long day of hiking, we arrived at the location marked on Dr. Thorne's map. The area was strangely quiet, with an oppressive sense of being watched. It was getting dark, so we set up our camp, figuring we'd have to wait till morning to begin exploring and searching for any signs of the missing cryptozoologist. As the sun was setting and the dinner was cooking over the campfire, a low growl echoed through the clearing. God, we all heard it and we all froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. We heard branches snapping all around us and realized we were surrounded. The 7 of us gathered as close to the fire as we could, scanning the trees around us for movement. Slowly, one by one, we could see massive figures moving through the shadows of the trees, and occasionally red eyes glowed in the fading light. God, we were all terrified and unsure of what to do. Were we safe by the fire, or should we run to our cars? Jason and another one of our male friends had guns, but no one expected that there would be so many of these creatures to deal with. Dr. Brooks whispered, "We need to show them that we are not aggressive. They are only concerned with keeping their forest safe." "Then why did they eat Hank's neighbor?" I asked. "We don't know that they're not going to eat us too." Amy was crying, and my words only made the matter worse. "I want you to listen to me," Dr. Brooks said with an authority that years of professorship had earned her. "I'm going to sit right here calmly and let these creatures approach me. I want the rest of you to slowly retreat to your vehicles, climb inside, and drive away. And do not come back until morning." We're not going to leave you here," Jason exclaimed. "Listen, I've lived my life studying these creatures," she says. "The opportunity to see them in person is the greatest gift anyone could ever have given me. And if I had to die here tonight, I will die with the happiness that comes from a lifetime of believing these creatures are real. And if I don't die tonight, I'll see you all in the morning. Now get out of here and leave me be." Regretfully, we just all did what she said. The 6 of us slowly walked to our cars and got inside. Red eyes glowed all around us, but we were able to drive away from the campsite without an incident. God, I really feel bad leaving her here, Jason said. You know, she wouldn't have come with us, I told him, but I also regretted our decision not to stay with her or to convince her to come back with us. That night, in the hotel in town, the 6 of us debated whether we should call the authorities and report what we had seen, and that we had left an elderly woman out in the forest all by herself. Because of how it sounded, we decided not to say anything to anyone. But at dawn's first light, we were all heading back out to the campsite. Not a one of us had slept a wink all night. And when we got to the campsite, now our tents were still there, along with all of our camping gear. Massive footprints surrounded the campfire and all around our campsite. But there was no sign of Dr. Brooks. And now, every year, my friends and I discuss among ourselves if we should return to that area. But as of yet, we haven't. Well, there you go, friends. That's a fun one. What do you think happened there? Man, oh man. Little red eyes and surrounded by him. That's a heck of a show. Well, I just enjoyed the fact that we had a listener send in a story and got to show you a little something different tonight. Yeah, and it was kind of fun. So listen, next time I see you, which will probably be pretty soon, maybe tomorrow night, we'll have some more stories from someone. And if any of you have a story you'd like to share with the listeners and with us here at the Hidden Corners, send it in once again to thehiddencorners.story@gmail.com. Look forward to it. And until then, I'll see ya. This is Clay Steele.